TE Talks with Guides is a weekly podcast for lovers of history, travel, and all things Italian.
All right, everybody. Thanks for coming back and staying with us with Through Eternity Talks with Guides. As we've always said before, I've always found it fascinating to be able to have conversations with the people that I work with, because we're all guides. And, we continuously, lots of times clients want to know, how do you keep this information and how does it stay in your head? I do say through repetition, but a thing that is so important for us is that we need to keep things vibrant. We love to read books about stuff, to look at things from a different point of view. And I've always been so enthusiastic about these conversations, and I've always wanted to have a way to share this with our clients, people who have done tours with us in the past, and people who will eventually come with us in the future. And it's wonderful because, especially with podcasts, when you're doing things like driving around somewhere, maybe driving in the commute to work and fantasizing about your trip to come to Italy, or even exercising on the treadmill, doing some kind of cardio work. These are wonderful things to have with us. And we're also going to be videotaping this through Zoom, and because with our conversations, we're going to be bringing up certain places or certain individuals, and we're going to try to edit into the conversation. So if you even want to see who we are and see some of these things, you can join us also on our YouTube channel. Now, today with Through Eternity Tours Talks with Guides, we have a lovely person who is a very, very dear friend of mine, Gracelyn, who has been a guide with us for many years. Ciao, Gracelyn.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing great, Rob. How are you doing?
I'm good. So I'm Zooming from London, and you are Zooming from Rome. Now, just to let you guys know, Gracelyn and I had to go through a great rigorous journey because we studied to pass the official tour guide exam for Rome and the Lazio region together. She's one of the most organized individuals, and she knows me very, very well. So she was really able to help me with it. And you can even see in the back of her room, we have 2 posters that we bought because we love to have these things to help memorize stuff and learn and see the churches of Rome in one of them and the palaces of Rome in the other. So, and she decided to frame it. So, Gracelyn, let me just talk about a few things here. How long have you been working with Through Eternity Tours?
How long? Okay. I had the pleasure of meeting you in the year 2007.
Wow.
So
that's about 13 years, right?
I'm just coming up on 14 years in Rome. Mm-hmm.
Tempus fugit, right? Or they say time flies. And, I have always loved having you work with us because you have a special knack. I mean, people can tell that Gracelyn is American, Italian-American, which is an advantage, but it's not only that, it's, your gift, Gracelyn, for connecting with people, no matter who they are or where they are. I think that's one of your greatest talents, among many other things. And you guys can all look about things of reviews of her throughout the internet because she's become quite famous, or at least in my book, she's quite famous. So Gracelyn, I've always asked all of the guides, what do you want to talk about? What do you think would be interesting to talk about on a podcast? And from what we discussed a little bit beforehand, I think we're going to be talking about the Renaissance today, not just generally the Renaissance, and this is what I want to throw out to you, and then you can tell me your take on it, and let's go for the conversation from there. But the idea that in the Renaissance, which, some people like to classify as a rebirth, Rinascimento, rebirth of the classic world, it's also a time of education, of higher learning, of philosophy, and not just certain individuals, but many people who are, even artists. It's so funny. We can go into the Raphael rooms or Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, which everyone does when they come to Rome, or you go to Florence and you learn all about this stuff. It's like they must have been extremely well educated themselves, right? So How was it? What was it like for education in the Renaissance? I guess I thought this is something that we would talk about, and how would it be something was, for certain individuals, and then it became more used with others, and how this changed the world. And really started, it's funny, when we had to study for the test, right? They often refer to time periods. And they say the Renaissance, let's say the 1400s onwards, that's modern times, which for many of us, especially in the States, we kind of find funny. So
modern is a relative term when you move here.
It is. So tell me, what would you like to talk about?
Okay. You're really hitting the nail on the head, because you're talking about the education really bringing across a movement, the humanist movement. And, I love when clients ask me, and I even had a client ask me once, is there something in the water here? Like, what is the deal about Italy that's so special that you can have in such a short time period? I mean, Sandro Botticelli, Da Vinci, Masaccio, Titian, Michelangelo, Raphael, and I mean, you could just go on this laundry list. A lot of it goes back to this movement, but if you're going to talk about the movement, it's really interesting to go back a little bit further, because you really do. You have to go back to the late 1200s and the 1300s. And while you're going back there, if you're talking about education, you have to imagine in the late Middle Ages, this is when we're going to start getting universities through Italy. Okay, so let's just talk in general education.
Mm-hmm.
Now, are people educated? Oddly, when they say 13th century Italy,
Mm-hmm.
there was a rate of literacy here from about 10 to 25%. That's an estimation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for us today, that seems like nothing, but for Europe, Italy had one of the highest literacy rates. So there's a whole lot of cool theories about that. And one of them is it's a holdover from ancient Rome. You don't just erase all the libraries from late antiquity through the time of the Renaissance. So you start to get these universities, but they're not universities like we have them today. They're specialized. So we're talking that the people who are the wealthiest are going to go on to higher education. What is it going to be? I'm going to be a doctor with lots of schools of medicine for physicians, and one of the oldest universities in Italy, if not in all of Europe, is really Bologna. Now, what was that focus? That focus is more on law. Later, we get La Sapienza, university in Rome, 1300, but that also, the focus is law. So people are going to go into certain little categories. They're going to study to be a lawyer. You're going to study to be a doctor. Or what is the other big one, which you can probably guess? Theology. Okay, so we're moving into the clergy.
More so in Rome than anywhere else. Yeah, sure.
Right? This is what we're talking about when we're talking about education. Now, you're going to get this movement that starts in the 14th century, late 13th, 14th century, because this is the time period. Think about in art, changes in art. You think about Giotto, okay? Mm-hmm. You think about, let's say, Dante Alighieri, right? Then let's talk about Petrarch, okay? Francesco Petrarca. Okay, what's happening at this point? Now, if you think about someone, just one example, they call Petrarch the father of humanism. He was studying law, so he goes to university. His father was a lawyer. His father goes off to Avignon, France, because the popes are off in Avignon, France. He's going to be a lawyer, but that's not what interests him. What interests him are the Latin and the Greek writers. So he starts to focus more and more on this. Boccaccio, there's going to be all of these great minds. Who are they? Oddly, the majority of them are clergy, taking the orders, not others. They're wealthier classes, because you have to think, who is capable of even reading a book at this time period? You think cost involved of reading a book. But they're the ones who are going to start looking at things like Plato and looking in a really, really different way and saying, well, wait a minute. Prior, we're focusing on something really specific. But now things are going to start changing, because they're going to say, hey, it's not like pagan bad, Christian good, that we can only study a certain way. They're going to look into the humanities, humanitas. Now, if you look at it in terms of something like Cicero, he's saying more like the liberal arts, because what are the things that are going to help us no matter what we're doing, and especially to rule well. We're going to look at the humanities. And that's not just going to be those specific lines of study, but it's also going to be poetry. It's going to be philosophy. It's Petrarch who's also going to be the one who's going to start saying, like, hey, Plato. Okay, we're bringing back the ideas of Plato. It's not that it's contrary to Christian beliefs. It's complementary to Christian beliefs. So we're going to get this kind of a change that's going to lead to a change of education in the time period of the Renaissance. You know, oddly, they're looking in the past to move to the future.
Wow, this is excuse me for interrupting you, but you know, I mean, it's really fascinating. It's like for me to be in a candy shop, but I do want to like bring out a couple of questions that I have for you with this. Hopefully, I haven't messed up your rhythm too much because it's really, really great. So, you know, could you succinctly give a response to people? I know you've actually said it, you know, study of the humanities, but if we would have to, you know, it's wonderful what you're doing because it puts things into a context, especially for people. It's what is wonderful about doing these podcasts is that we have the luxury to be able to go into detail about it. When we don't have to, we're like, okay, we have to get to the Colosseum in about 15 minutes. So I'll tell you this in 2 seconds, but at least here, let us address what is humanism?
What is humanism? Okay.
Yeah.
Humanism is a mindset of study having to do with the importance on certain things like grammar and rhetoric. Okay, grammar and rhetoric may seem dry, but the idea is we're looking to the greater goodness, and eloquence becomes important again. Eloquence in writing, eloquence in speaking. We can't do that unless we're studying grammar, unless we're studying rhetoric. Poetry, philosophy, history, looking back, what was the best of the ancient times as opposed to the negative of the ancient times that can help us today to live a better life. And also for people who are in the position of governing, to help them, how do you govern better? I think the best example, to be honest, is to talk about the Medicis and their influence, if you want to go directly to some type of a way to make it really succinct. I mean, think about Cosimo de' Medici, because you have to talk about Cosimo first, because this is Lorenzo il Magnifico, his grandfather. Now, he's born in the 1300s, dies in the 1400s, so he's also part of this line of study, but there's a lot of really cool things that are happening at this point. People are not only starting to say, oh, wow, I see value in humanism. They want more. So they're looking for the books. They're looking for the manuscripts. Where are you going to find them?
Exactly. That's what I was going to bring my next question to. And I also wanted to say that you very eloquently put how this kind of idea of even going back to the classic world, but it still works with theology and the thought of the time and the church. It did not create a conflict necessarily. They were able to cohesively work together, and that's how they were able to, I mean, just have this beautiful explosion on so many levels of so many different things with the philosophy and the way that they looked at the world, and then, of course, how visually that was manifested. And, okay, so my other question was, what's the situation? I mean, because it was significant for us, it's like books, libraries, how did they get this knowledge out? What were the books like at that time? And then was it easy for them to get books? Who got the books? Who had the libraries? And how did it change?
Okay, it changes dramatically because, you know, when we're studying and going back to ancient Rome, remember when we started studying all the bath complexes and what the layout for the bath and baths of Trajan are the first that get the layout, and there's got to be Greek library, Latin library. So imagine how important these libraries were. Once we move into the Middle Ages, these libraries are, in a sense, going to disappear. And I mean, in a sense, going to disappear in the sense of, like in a public setting, who has the hold of the books? The monks, okay, clergy. And this is actually really important because we will get to a point where they're saying, you know, what we want people to learn is really having to do with Christianity, If you're going to do philosophy, Christianity, let's look at St. Augustine. Let's look at, Christian writings. But at the same time, it was really important for them to preserve the books, to copy the books. Think of the film. Remember Name of the Rose. And think that we're copying, we're writing. Now, they've got their hands on books, but also wealthy have their hands on books, because it's not a book like we have today. Think about an illuminated manuscript. Think about somebody who could afford one. Think about the amount of time, not just taking those sheepskin and taking pumice and making them nice and smooth, copying the books, bringing in even the illustrators who are going to do the miniature art. They're going to use gold leaf. They're going to use lapis lazuli and all these fantastic colors. Who's going to have a book like that? It's going to be upper level clergy, the bishops. It's going to be somebody super, super wealthy. Now, that's not to say that all the books were like this, because you've got ones that are much more rough, that are much more less beautiful, easier copies, smaller. If there were people who were, let's say, literate, other than the very, very wealthy and the clergy, because remember, they're the ones, private libraries and libraries in the monasteries, it was part of the Benedictine rule also maintaining these libraries and these books. It's going to be the merchant class, because as soon as we get to a system, and you think about the great merchants of Venice, right?
Sure.
Shakespeare, the great merchants of Venice. But now it's not a merchant who's just going places. They need to correspond. So they are literate. They're literate to a point. They may not be reading Latin, they may not be reading Plato, but they have to be able to read, they have to be able to write, they have to be able to correspond. So they say that probably in those types of homes, there were books. Maybe they had a Bible. Maybe they had really simple books that had to do with things you needed every day. Medicine, herbs, remedies, and a variety of other things. But as for the sense of libraries, we're going to move into that a little bit later. How do we get our hands on these very precious materials? Because the most expensive books, I was reading one article that said you have to think, for a merchant, those books that the upper class had or that the clergy had, maybe that was a year's salary. So they're not going to have those books. But we're talking about access. When you get some of these wealthy people who are so keyed in to this concept of humanism and spreading this concept of goodness and beauty and wisdom, their private libraries eventually are going to become like public libraries. Think about the library designed by Michelangelo in Florence. That root of that is Cosimo de' Medici. Mm-hmm. Something kind of cool about him, because now imagine he is fully believing in this idea of philanthropy. That's also a Greek idea connected to humanism, philanthropy. So it's not just for me, it's for the greater good. So he is going to sponsor many, many people, including a man by the name of Marsilio Ficino. And Ficino was really important because this is going to lead you to Michelangelo.
Okay.
His father was a physician. He was being trained as a physician. He was a physician, his father, for Cosimo de' Medici.
Okay.
He was extremely bright. He was interested in philosophy, reading philosophy. And he finally is convinced by Cosimo, kind of takes him under his wing, you should study Greek, because that way, not only can you translate and understand the Latin, but you can go to the original translations. And he starts to supply him with these manuscripts, because what not everybody knows, this becomes a treasure hunt. People like the Medicis and wealthy, they're sending people out to these monasteries that nobody has visited in forever to go through their libraries and start looking. And the cool part is they're making discoveries, and they're finding letters of Cicero here and Vitruvius here. Mm-hmm. And all of this stuff is going to be copied, and it's going to start to disseminate. Now, at this time period, this man Ficino, who is going to work with Cosimo de' Medici, he puts him in charge of a school that he begins. He wants to do like the academy, Plato's Academy, and he does it in Florence. Now, you have to think about who the people are who were involved at the time. And the interesting part, when you think, you've got famous writers, you have got philosophers, they're all listening to this man who is also a Catholic priest. So he is the one who really is pushing that idea of the movement and saying how important this is to Christianity, because for us to have better leaders and people who are doing philanthropic work like Cosimo de' Medici, and then of course we'll talk about Lorenzo the Magnificent, they have to understand that these theories of Plato, it's really truth, beauty, goodness. And that follows through directly with Christianity. So now it's not going to be, that whole you should be focusing only on what you learn in a church. The artwork in the churches were called the Pauper's Bible.
That's to visualize.
Biblia Pauperum, that's what it was for. It was to go in. I can't read, but at least I look up, and if we see St. Jerome, there's going to be the lion or the Bible. If we see St. Sebastian, there's going to be the arrows. So we can read the Bible there. Now we're going to start looking at the world in a different way. And
can I ask you a question now? Because you bring up all of this aspect. In fact, I love when we go into the Pinacoteca, I specifically use that as an opportunity that we use the Bible as visualized. Because first of all, a lot of people don't know how to read. And a lot of people can't own a Bible because its books are very expensive. We can always talk about things of what we take for granted in our time period as opposed to what was it like in the ancient or even in the Renaissance, the beginning of modern times. Could you feasibly give a percentage saying, okay, you've mentioned we have the clergy, the higher end clergy, the wealthy, that sometimes would go hand in hand, like the cardinals being the princes of the church. You have the merchants, which would be more of an upper middle class, I would say, in our context, right? Who else was able to get an education? What was the percentage of these people? And who are the ones that would have access to these books? Because you mentioned, and what I thought when you brought up to me, you're like, oh, Michelangelo doing this library and philanthropy, which are great concepts that are still prevalent today. I mean, some of the greatest things that we have are thanks to philanthropical movements by people. We talk about, Bill Gates and many, many others, all these people in the Silicon Valley, or, the great investor, Warren Betty, I think his name is. I'm like getting a mind for it here. Anyway, but the thing what I would ask you is who had access to this stuff? Who was allowed to, what was the percentage? Okay, two questions. Percentage of people who could read and who couldn't read. Okay. And then who were able to even access a public library like the one Michelangelo designed. Was it just anybody could walk in? I wouldn't imagine. You had to be invited. You'd have to get a special pass.
Yeah, yes and no. There was access to libraries in the monasteries, but not for everyone. Okay, so scholars did have access. But once again, if we're talking scholars, we're normally talking more in the sense of upper class. I'm sorry, the second part of your question. Oh, you asked me about the schooling too. And it's really, really hard to say because in the early Middle Ages, there was still a carryover of church schools, but then they really don't start talking about them as much. But we do know from writing that people had hired teachers. Okay, they hired teachers for their children. What would the percentage be? I found one percentage in Florence that said 10%, but it's really hard to find numbers because if this is private, it's really hard to put a number on that. And they said it wasn't uncommon for a group of noble families to even have a teacher and combine like a small school. So combine and teaching a group of different people. And even this is going to change as the books become more available. But since you asked about that, now think about this. We get to the fall of Constantinople with the Ottoman Turks. This is going to be a really huge change. Yes. And if you think Cardinal Bessarion, this is a cardinal from Constantinople, he's going to do a donation of his private library in Greek and Latin, and he's going to give it to Venice. This is the beginning of the library, the Great Library in Venice. Then what's going on in Rome? Now we've got a humanist pope. Okay, we've got Nicholas V.
Mm-hmm.
Humanists, right? So he is also bringing in books from where? Constantinople. And we're trying to preserve the Greek, the Hebrew, the Latin. His idea, because the popes have only just come back to Rome, and his idea is this beautiful rebuilding of Rome, bring back the scholars, and also bring back the pilgrims. So the intention was in the sense of public library, even if it's not how you and I would think of a public library, anyone just randomly off the street can go in. But that was the intention. We talk about the beginning of the Vatican Library, 1475, that's Sixtus IV. But it really begins with Nicholas V.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time of Nicholas V, think that you have about 1,200 manuscripts, roughly. By the time we get to the official library in Platina, they say that he does a calculation of about 2,500, roughly. And now they've got the Vatican Library today, the last time I saw numbers on it was about 1.5 million for the books and about 75,000 for the manuscripts. So this is changed greatly. There are going to be libraries are going to be coming up in that time period, but the other change is something else. 1453, that's the end. By Constantinople, we've got Istanbul, and now you have influx that's been happening beforehand. So you get big Greek populations. So this information is also coming with them, and they're also becoming teachers of this humanist movement. They're involved because they're teaching Greek. They're teaching the Greek language. They're teaching about Plato. But it's also the time period. Remember, what happens in 1455? Gutenberg, the Bible. So this is that 200 copies that he prints off. That's going to change things drastically, because from the difference of 1455 and 1500, the accessibility of books is going to change, because now you're not waiting for the copyists. We're printing, and the printing press is going to go all throughout Europe, but especially Italy and also Germany.
Okay.
Remember the first one in Italy?
No, I don't remember the first one in Italy. Wait. The Benedictine monastery nearby Subiaco, yeah. Mm-hmm.
An hour and a half by car outside Rome. They're the very, very first. And if you think about what we're discussing here, grammar and rhetoric and philosophy, you say, okay, so the monastery in Subiaco has the first printing press. What are they printing? The Gospels, the Bible.
Of course.
They're printing grammar. They're printing Latin grammar. And then they're printing Cicero. So it's still, part of this whole story that we're talking about with this movement. You would assume it would be immediately religious, but it actually isn't. It was teacher of Saint Jerome, Donatus.
My God. Amazing. So this is amazing. So look, we're talking about the printing press was invented at what time period, and then it spread out through?
Absolutely. It's invented around, they say, 1436, 1440. Let's give it roughly, but by 1455, that's when we're printing the Gutenberg Bible. Okay?
Yes.
And by then, how it's going to explode. Many things. And you think about the printing press, and printing in Venice is going to be huge. That's where metallic type comes from.
Sure.
Population in Greek, they were doing smaller books in Greek, and they needed to fit more in pages, and they're doing this different alignment. But this is also another kind of push for the movement. But if you think, you asked before, we were talking about, where do these Renaissance men, the Michelangelos and the people that we're talking about with art, it's amazing when you think how many of them were invited to the Academy of the Medicis, and how many were sitting around the table in discussions, including Michelangelo, who was invited to live in the house of the Medicis. He was there. He was there with Ficino, Poliziano, all these wonderful philosophers sitting there with Lorenzo. And also by chance, and this has to do with his later commissions, who else is at the table but Lorenzo's kid?
Leo the 10th.
Exactly. And his nephew.
Clement the 7th.
The 7th.
Yes. Well, there's a good... Well, yeah, exactly. But I mean, it's kind of amazing. I wonder, well, first of all, let's just address this fact. So this, what you brought up, is a revolution, and it changes things when this happens, because with the printing press coming out, I don't know if a lot of people realize is that the printing press makes it easier to print these books, but that means that people have more access to it. Things are not as expensive. Books are no longer as expensive as they were. They have access to it. Education is getting better. In fact, one could even wonder if they begin to, when you have people that are educated, they can begin to question things. This is what we want when people are educating. When we want on our tours, we want people to ask questions with us, to have a dialogue, to look at interesting things, to look at things at a different point of view. But that could have kind of created things. It created many beautiful things, which we love to see, specifically in Florence, Venice, and in Rome, the Renaissance, right? But then it may have then led to excessive things that are going through. One could argue, right? One could argue with Martin Luther coming in and writing 95 Theses because of what was happening into this sink of iniquity, which was known as Rome at the moment, or at least some people had accused of it with the construction of St. Peter's, and a movement, of course, talking about and communicating through, a protest, the Protestant Reformation, which of course was,
Yes.
you know,
Power. Knowledge is power, and holding knowledge is keeping the power. So it's correct, because that's the change in the concept of news, because 95 Thesis, when he puts that on that door, it doesn't stay there. Copies are run and it's distributed. So it's not only books, it's pamphlets, it's literature, You also have to think that the only way for me to learn the Bible used to be to go to a church and to listen to the priest, listen to the gospel, listen to their interpretation. But if things are going to become cheaper, I can read it myself and I can come up with my own ideas, with my own interpretation.
Exactly. It's really interesting. There are two things that I can think of that are kind of like, kind of controversial, because in our own time period, and to backtrack because I looked it up, it was Warren Buffett. Okay, I was having a little bit of that I was talking about one of the wealthiest investors in the world who does a lot for charities, with a philanthropical movement, as we talked about. But the other thing that is fascinating is that even in our time, we don't have a printing press, but we're just talking about, as you brought up, a way to communicate to people much more quickly. And we're using this platform right now. It's the internet, and how information is spread through much more quickly to people. And especially now within the last 4 years, one used to think, I always have to point out to people, just because something is written doesn't make it the law or the truth, right? It makes it an interpretation of something. Well, now we're coming out with people on the internet who are giving news, and now we have a lovely thing that's called fake news or interpretive news. Especially in the time period that we're dealing with, you don't know what kind of information you're getting all at once. So here we are having another kind of revolution, I think, that goes on, and
the amount of information that's coming through,
yeah,
and finding the accuracy of the information.
exactly. And always, I even say when we're studying about stuff, even that, you try to say, okay, this is the information that has been presented to me, because we always go and read things. We always have contradictory information sometimes, that sometimes you say, okay, this is what I have accepted as, this is what I'm choosing to tell you. And the stories that we go over, or in the facts and the history, it is what I think seems the most plausible. But to get back to the history, now this is a kind of controversial question I'm going to ask you here, because you just brought it up, right? You brought up the fact of people are reading, and they're reading the Bible themselves, and they're beginning to question things on their own. They don't have to listen. They don't have to necessarily go into the church. Do you think the church at that point, like I said, it's kind of controversial, did they not want everyone to be educated? Did they want only the clergy to be educated? Did they want, because the more educated people were, the more they could question things. Do you want people necessarily, I'm talking about the general populace.
Absolutely. It's hard to say, because, we always think about things like the Inquisition. We think about Galileo. Okay. But we don't always think about that it was the same popes at this time period who were really sponsoring the sciences and curious, but then there were limitations.
Sure.
There were always limitations. The man who I mentioned, Marsilio Ficino, in the house of the Medicis, both caused. Okay, he affected, and you can purely look at or read Michelangelo's poetry and go, oh yeah, this idea of beauty, platonic love, all kinds of stuff, or what we can see in The Room of the Signature by Raphael, Philochigi, but you look at all the meanings behind the art and say this could only happen at that time period. But even he himself, who was a priest, sometimes got into trouble because they were mixing mysticism, alchemy, but all of these things were open. That's when the church would pull back and they would need to answer for this stuff. So did the limits go too far? Sometimes yes. And, even the most open humanist of popes, there were boundaries in how far you could go.
Sure.
So they existed, sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because even now today, nations have difficulty about information that's being spread about, but how can one control it, or should they control it? Because we have fake information being out and real factual information being sent out. So it is a question because we have our freedoms, right? A freedom of speech, or but anyway, it's just kind of interesting to even think about.
Right. Well, it's even if you took the art of the Renaissance and then let's just say you showed it to a pope from 100 years before, 200 years before, most of it would have seen, or some of it would have seen, like Michelangelo's nude would have seen a pornographic.
Sure.
And which happened again later. After,
exactly. I've always found a great comfort in things of that history repeats itself. That's a great case in point. And so the good things repeat themselves and the bad things repeat themselves. And I always say that people need to look back into the past to see how things play out sometimes.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And that was part of this whole time period, that beauty of looking to the past to find how we can better the future. And that's really, really important when you think about it, because even looking back to the past for the buildings, think about the amount of building that took place, not just the painting and the sculpture, beautiful piazzas and fountains and public spaces. The public spaces became important because they're looking back, they're reading the Latin writers again. What's the worst time period? You think of the megalomaniacs, you think about Nero, you think about the money being spent. I'm spending it on me, I'm spending it on me.
Sure.
Like others, even the time of Augustus, where we're building, and we're rebuilding the city, and the people who work with us are rebuilding the city, and Agrippa is adding in a bath complex. That's when the Pantheon is being built. That's when all these wonderful things in Crypto Balbi and the theaters and Teatro Marcello is finished. It's the same thing. They know, how do you manage and rule wisely? Because wisdom is really important. How do you rule wisely? Make the world of everybody better. And it also has to do with that theory of the soul is eternal, partially coming back from Plato and also from all these great philosophers at this time period. If the soul is eternal, man has the spark of God within them. We're created in God's image. Sure. That beautiful finger of creation. And you look at Adam, this gorgeous nude of Adam, and again, with intention. Or I love the Room of the Signature is such a fantastic room, because you look up and you say, this is humanism encapsulated in a little room. And you look at the allegories and you go, look, theology, philosophy, poetry, justice. And you see how one room for a pope comes together, and there's no conflict between the School of Athens. The dispute of the Blessed Sacrament. If anything, it's beautifully complementary. And when you look back to the School of Athens, not everybody notices. Do you ever notice the two niches on the left and the right, and the two statues there? You see
Sure.
Are they the goddess of wisdom and the god of beauty? So you see watching over the scene. But beautiful, tied together. It's the humanist movement tied together in a little ribbon, like a little package walking into the room of the signature.
Well, this is great because, and it's funny, if people who will be coming to Italy or when they have been, this is such a lovely way to describe that room, which, normally we have to go through very quickly because we have to get to the Sistine Chapel. Another thing that I really love, and I've always loved, is how things are connected, and how these connections apply to each and every one of us. So you're talking about the world of the Renaissance, and the religion is Christianity, but how even so, and it may seem disconnected to us because the ancient world is the pagan world, but they were able to take things and interpret them and apply it to themselves, which is something that we can always do. And of course, in Rome and in many things in Italy, we always have something that is connected to the past, to the ancient world, which I think is wonderful.
And, we're doing the same thing today. Even right now, I was thinking about the other day with the world situation, looking to your higher angels. What it's about. And it's singing from balconies and calling people and conversing and expressing yourself and reaching out to old friends. And it's a dialogue again. Mm-hmm. Because we have time for it, so we're forced into it. But even that in and of itself, it kind of is very fitting when you think about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Gracelyn, this is like a whole world that we've dealt with quickly, and just kind of a surface level. And it kind of makes me come to minds of other discussions that we can talk about, which I would love to. I always say the Renaissance is an economic boom, and we can talk about in the future about why that is. Because when you're talking about construction, when you're talking about things being created, that is because money is flowing, and you have people making donations or doing public works for their own reasons, or for magnanimous reasons, or for their own selfish reasons. But it's just very, very interesting. I would love to have invite you to have another discussion to talk about the economic boom that was the Renaissance and where it started and where it went through. But I'm sorry, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about with us today, or do you think that kind of gets it through?
No, it just makes me anxious to get back and get into all these beautiful sites. I miss every single one of them.
No, I know. So, we are going to ask you to send us a list of the names and the places, but specifically you brought up a lot of individuals, right? And so we're going to supply this for people who want to see it. We're going to publicize it, links also to some of this interesting information, or maybe even a list of some of the books that you've read. I did want to bring up the Irish because there is a Thomas Cahill book called How the Irish Saved Civilization, with the Irish monks. No one could get in and conquer Ireland because it was so remote. And so a lot of the texts were saved in Ireland. But that's another story. Anyway, thank you so much, darling. It's always such a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks. Ciao, Rob.
Ciao, darling.
Thank you for listening to our TE Talks with Guides. We have a new episode every Wednesday. Please subscribe to get an alert when each podcast comes out. Rate us and tell people how you enjoyed it, and share it on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Most importantly, if you enjoyed it, send us a feedback about the show. Also, if you are curious about what some of these people and places we talked about look like, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch the video on this podcast, where we have inserted special images for you to further enjoy the story.